Hi, everyone. Welcome to Israel after the Afghanistan crisis, the new geopolitics of the Middle East. We will be beginning in just a few minutes as people continue coming in. I just wanted to let you know a few quick things. You are able to enable or disable closed captionings for this call. Note that it is auto-generated, so a few of the words, names might be misspelled, but will later be corrected for the recording that will be uploaded after the fact. Note also that this webinar will be recorded. And at the end of the session, we will have a few Q&A minutes. Hopefully we'll get to as many questions as we can. But if we don't, we hope you will continue following us and emailing us for any further questions. Now I will pass it on to Elie Rekhess, and we can remove the slide and begin. Thank you very much.
Okay, there we are. Hello, good morning, good evening, good night to all our guests and participants, wherever you are on the globe. I have the pleasure of opening our three-session virtual series on Israel after the Afghanistan crisis, the new geopolitics of the Middle East. I'm Elie Rekhess, the Crown Visiting Professor in Israel Studies at Northwestern. I'm also the head of IIP, the Israel Innovation Project. This mini conference is co-sponsored by the Office of Northwestern Vice President for International Relations. More importantly, or less importantly, is co-organized in collaboration with the Faculty of Social Sciences at Tel Aviv University under the leadership of Dean Itai Sened, who is with us. I'd first like to thank our co-sponsor, co-organizer, and all those who helped spread the word about this event, particularly Crystal Falcaro-Hibbs, our program assistant, who was so instrumental in putting this program together. A quick opening remark. Following the Afghanistan crisis, the geopolitical instability in the already fragile Middle East and North Africa region may only further intensify. It seems that it will be directly or indirectly affecting Israel, its neighbors, and the regional and international powers engaged in the Middle East arena. To address these realities, we have gathered an excellent panel of leading global experts from the US, Europe, and Israel, who will discuss the repercussions of the Afghanistan crisis from three different perspectives. Today, the first session will be dealing with Islam. The second session in 2 weeks' time is entitled The Impact on the Regional and International Powers in the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, Russia, and the US. And the third and last session, by the way, the second session will be chaired by Itai, by Dean Sened. And the third session, New Regional Configurations, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and the Palestinians. This is due on November 4th. For further details, if you want to know how to link and so forth, I invite you to visit our website, iip.northwestern.edu, where you may also learn more about what IIP does in promoting collaboration, academic and scientific collaboration between Northwestern and Israeli universities. So without further ado, let's delve into the opening session, and I'll begin by introducing our esteemed panelists alphabetically. So first to go is David Cook. Hi, David.
Hello.
David is a professor at Rice University. He did his undergrad studies and degrees at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and received his PhD from the University of Chicago. His areas of specializations include early Islamic history, Muslim apocalyptic literature and movements, classical and contemporary, radical Islam, historical astronomy. I don't know if we'll get to that today, David, who knows, and Judeo-Arabic literature. He's the author of many books, amongst which are Studies in Muslim Apocalyptic, Understanding Jihad, which was published by Berkeley in 2005, Contemporary Muslim Apocalyptic Literature, Martyrdom in Islam, 2007, Addressing and Understanding, or Understanding and Addressing Suicide Attacks, the Syrian Muslim Apocalyptic Heritage, an annotated translation from Kitab al-Fitan, the Book of Tribulation, which was more or less recently published in 2018. And he recently became the co-editor of the Edinburgh University Press series on Islamic apocalyptic and eschatology. So, David, welcome. Next in line, Bernard Haykel. Bernard, where are you? Yes, hi. Hello, Bernard, and welcome. So, Bernard is a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. He earned his BA from Georgetown University and his master's and PhD from the University of Oxford. At Princeton, he is the director of the Institute for Transregional Study of the Contemporary Middle East, and he focuses on the history, the politics, and the economics of the Arabian Peninsula. Bernard, if I may, I will call everybody by first name. I hope it's okay. Bernard is considered an authority on Islamist political movement and Islamic law, and is the author of numerous articles on the politics of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Salafism, Al-Qaeda, and IS. Among his books that he wrote and co-edited are Saudi Arabia in Transition, Insights on Social, Political, Economic, and Religious Change, Revival and Reform in Islam, The Legacy of Muhammad al-Shawkani, published in 23, and he's presently completing a manuscript book on Saudi Arabia's political history to be published by Princeton University Press. So welcome, Bernard. I hope I'm making no mistakes. If I do, correct me the first time you have the chance to speak. And our third speaker, who I hope is around, I see his box, but Gilles, if you are there. Oh yes, here he is. Hello, Gilles, and welcome. It should be, what, 7 p.m. at your end or 6 p.m.? Yeah. So let me introduce Professor Gilles Kepel, who is a French political scientist and Arabist, specializing in the contemporary Middle East and Muslim in the West. He's a professor at Paris Sciences et Lettres University, and he chairs the Middle East and Mediterranean Excellence Program in the École Normale Supérieure of Paris. Gilles has authored more than 20 academic books on contemporary Islam, the Arab world, and Muslims in Europe, translated into many languages. I'll just mention a few. Muslim Extremism in Egypt, The Prophet and Pharaoh, 86. Allah in the West, Islamic Movements in America and Europe, 1997. Book that became popular, all the others as well. Jihad, The Trail of Political Islam, Harvard University Press, 2003. Al-Qaeda, in its own words, co-edited in 2008. Terror in France, The Rise of Jihad in the West, Princeton University Press, 2017. And most recently, Away from Chaos, the Middle East and the Challenge to the West. I should just add, this was 2020. His last essay, The Prophet and the Pandemic, from the Middle East to Atmospheric Jihadism. Well, maybe we'll hear a little bit about that. Okay, so these are our speakers. You're most welcome, and I suggest that I'll begin the discussion. There are 4 major issues that I hope to be covering today. The first is the question whether what happened in Afghanistan is a victory for radical Islam. Then we'll speak about global jihad, IS, and the Israeli scene. So My first question addressed to all of you, and whoever wants to pick the microphone, you're welcome to do so. If I need to moderate, I'll do so. So my question is, can what happened in Afghanistan in mid-August can be seen as a landmark, a great victory for radical Islam, and a proof that this trend in the interpretation of Islam is indeed successful. Let me a little bit elaborate. So we have an Islamic Emirate, if the name is still valid. Would it advance the foremost of the strictest interpretation of Sharia, both in daily practices and in overall political orientation? We need, understandably, to differentiate between different countries and regions, but we should also add that there are those who, conversely, say that we need not expect extremist moves, but rather political pragmatism on the part of the new regime. So, what's your take on this first issue? David, I see you.
I'll be happy to go first.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
and remember, guys, I'm sorry to say that I'm the moderator. It's a very uneasy position because I have the time going on, so I will indicate to you whether when the answer needs to be short. Go ahead, David.
I think that this was a tremendous victory for the Taliban, much more absolute than the one that they had in 1997 to 2001. And the reason why is because right now there's no obvious pole around which resistance to the Taliban can be formed. And so, I mean, their control of the country is not absolute, but it is much more absolute than it was in the first time that they ruled. So honestly, I think that this is a tremendous victory, but it is not necessarily, in my opinion, a victory for globalist Islam, so much as it is for localist Islam.
I see. Well, I meant short, but not that short, David.
Oh, well, I can always go on. The other thing that I would like to comment on that I think is different is the question of spiritual authority that was much stronger in the Taliban in their first iteration, where you had Mullah Omar Mujahid, who definitely had strong spiritual authority and could even claim titles like Amir al-Mu'mineen and so forth that had some transnational aspect to them. But today, I don't really see, like somebody who is who's stepping forth and actually, kind of like filling that particular slot. So I think that, in my opinion, is quite different right there.
Okay, thank you. Bernard, Gilles? Bernard?
I mean, I'm happy to go next, unless Gilles, you'd like to go.
Go ahead.
I agree with David. I mean, it's definitely a victory for the Taliban. But I think if one adopts a kind of a 30,000 foot view of Islamism in general. Sorry, there's a siren here in New York City that you probably hear. But if you adopt this very high altitude view, I think that Islamism in general is globally is on the decline, and that is because I see it looking at it just from a structural and sort of materialist perspective, that Islamism was a byproduct or a product of the Cold War. There were many states that were funding it. There were, there was a kind of there was a vacuum, an ideological vacuum left open by the defeat of Arab nationalism, plus petrodollars going into funding it. Now, we live in a very different world today. We don't have the Cold War, at least not in the way that it was before. We have a different kind of Cold War that's emerging with China. The mobilization of Islam and Islamism against the communism is no longer there. Saudi Arabia, for instance, is no longer in the business of funding any kind of Islam anywhere, including domestically. You still have Turkey and Qatar, who are flirting with the Muslim Brotherhood, but the global landscape has changed dramatically, and states no longer are interested in this ideology. So as a result, I see a kind of long-term secular decline of Islamism, even though it'll flare up in places like Afghanistan, or certainly throughout Africa. You see jihadist movements still engaged. But on the whole, I'm quite sort of optimistic that jihadist Islamism is, no longer has major sponsors, and as a consequence, we'll see a decline. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't have lone wolf attacks, and you have a real problem with jihadists in Europe, even in potentially in the United States. But those are kind of not central, I think, manifestations of the problem anymore, because the problem is receding.
But now, quick interruption. I mean, you mentioned secular Islam. Now, this is a
No, I meant secular decline. No, I meant secular decline, meaning a long-term decline, not secular in the religious sense. Sorry, I just meant it in
secular decline of
Islamism, and of jihadism.
What does it mean?
It means just long-term, a long-term trend towards decline.
Okay,
that's what. That's
maybe we can come back to that, because I think it needs might need further elaboration. Gilles Kepel, please, the mic is yours.
Well, thank you. Looking at what cyber jihadists said about the victory of the Taliban, I mean, to some extent, there was a sigh of relief after the final failure of ISIS, or Daesh, as it calls itself, and as we call it from France, because, they were sort of shocked after ISIS was destroyed. And then suddenly, hey guys, the kids are back. And a number of jihadi or pro-jihadi groups that were banned from France and who have taken shelter in Turkey, which is a land of shelter for all those groups, just rejoiced and said, now there's going to be bridges and roads and happiness under Sharia, Islamism is back and the like. But there was not much following. And those groups do not have the capacity to mobilize significantly. So even though there were, outcries of happiness, of joy, of praise, this did not translate into much for the time being, because the Taliban are something which is quite foreign to most jihadis in Europe, whether they are from Arab origin or from Turkish origin, maybe closer to the Indo-Pakistani field that you have in Britain, or the subcontinental field, because it is difficult to imagine that the Taliban could have made this swift move without the help of the former and still alive and kicking ISI, the inter-service intelligence that had already boosted the old-time Taliban, the fathers of the present Taliban. But as far as the sort of Arab speakers and Turkish speakers, it is kind of far away. It doesn't resound immediately in their parlance. Daesh or ISIS was an Arab movement. They had connections. They had networks, and this is quite remote. Now, one question which is debated over here, and I'm not really a specialist of Afghanistan per se, even though I went there at the time of the Taliban, was what to make of it. Is it mainly a movement which is a sort of national jihadist movement, to say, to use this strange quotation, or i.e. that they are interested first and foremost into implementing Sharia in their own country, in reigning in any kind of a position. And I was struck by what David said earlier on, that The difference he sees between today and the days before was that there was a significant opposition at the time, and this seems to have been destroyed very quickly after the takeover of Kabul, even in Panjshir and the like. So are they interested mainly in their own business? And hence, even though the ideology has not really changed, the environment is different. China is around and and open to making business with the Taliban. Russia, for all what it means, which was ousted on the 15th of February in 1989 under its then Red Army uniform from Kabul, now seems pleased that they are around. They haven't closed their embassy because whatever harms the US is good for them. And the Chinese have already given a grant, but the Taliban should be careful, because when the Chinese give you a grant for free, usually you end up selling your family jewels a few months later because you have to pay back. They want to make of Kabul a sort of a stop on the One Belt, One Road way towards the west. Whether the Taliban will use that to send the opium back to China on this eastward is another option. So they are willing, they are open to making deals probably, and the Chinese also are keen to influence Taliban, as they have influenced a number of petro-monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula, with whom they had deals that they gave no support to the Uyghurs, which is of course very important to the Chinese, and the local elites in the peninsula that were bribed by the Chinese, of course, have remained very silent. Now, that's one thing. So that's for the sort of no problem, just the Afghans will have to deal with them. The other option is that, actually it's just, that's what we see on the surface, but the Taliban could not have won without significant regional help, particularly the Pakistanis, which I mentioned earlier on. But some say also that as opposed as the Taliban and the Iranian Shia are, because the Taliban killed Hazaras, they killed Iranian diplomats in Mazar-e-Sharif in their first emirate. Nevertheless, whatever harms the US is good for Tehran. And then some say that there was some significant help from the Pasdaran to the Taliban in order to reconquer Kabul. So this have to be documented for the time being. And this, of course, leaves open the possibility of having a new sort of hotbed of outward-looking jihadists in Kabul. So I'm in no position to sort of make a decision. It's probably too early, but I believe that this is the spectrum. If you allow me to say one more thing, from a European point of view, which I believe is quite different from what you have in the US, the feeling here and on this side, on the wrong side of the Atlantic now, of which NATO is not interested in anymore now that we have SPITO, or the South Pacific Treaty Organization, in the making. The feeling is that the Taliban takeover means that the US is not really interested in bringing so much effort, money, and manpower, and anything for the stability of the Middle East and of Europe. And that sounds as a sort of warning bell for a number of European countries in terms of whether or not they should take their own defense and security issues in their hands, in cooperation with the US, but the umbrella that was NATO was struck her decisive blow after the catastrophic pullout of Kabul, even though this was announced by Obama, mentioned by Trump, and implemented by Biden. But nevertheless, it didn't go very well. And this has risen a lot of questions on our shores.
Okay, I just want to say thank you and for putting the European perspective in. We will be dealing in our other sessions with the global powers. But if I may go back to the question that I think needs clarification, and I would address it to Bernard and to David. The question of Sharia. When you read world press, public opinion, the world is concerned, and learned observers have noted that Sharia will be implemented. Now, what does it mean? What does implementation of Sharia means, and where? So my question is do you notice, or is this turning point significant to the stricter implementation of Sharia norms in Afghanistan, elsewhere in the world, or because the impression that I received from what you said, Bernard, and to some extent, David, is that it's to some extent passé. And when I look at least on the Palestinian scene with which I'm more familiar, I don't see that. I mean, there are maybe different modes, different kinds. So please, what's the fate of Sharia or of implementation of Sharia? Bernard, you want to start maybe?
Look, I mean, one has to distinguish between claims about wanting to implement Sharia, which most, if not all, Islamist movements, from those that are jihadists to those that are that claim to participate and to believe in democratic practices and participate in them and principles, all of them talk about the Sharia as a solution to all of mankind's problems, and that if it were implemented properly, the state would be just. And justice is a profoundly important principle that resonates with many people in the Arab and Muslim world, because many of them live in regimes or under regimes that are unjust, and where you have very bad governance and a lot of corruption and brutalization of the population, all that. So at one level, the appeal to the Sharia is a general kind of very abstract appeal to a system of justice. At another level, of course, it is specific injunctions and specific rules and laws that are imposed on a population. So typically, women often get the short end of the stick when an Islamist movement comes to power, like the Taliban has now in Afghanistan, and they will, to use a term that we now has become quite common in the United States, the Taliban will virtue signal. They will signal their adherence and fidelity to Islam by imposing Sharia, especially when it comes to women. So they'll control the dress, the habits, the movements, the professional opportunities that women will or will not have in society, in Afghan society. So that's how it typically gets implemented. I don't think the Taliban, for instance, who, by the way, are Deobandi Sunni Muslims, they're not Salafis, will say that doing business with China is because the Chinese are infidels, are non-Muslims. Doing business with them is, or dealing with them, or even accepting their aid, is against the Sharia. They will be very happy to do business with the Chinese, as we see already. And as Gilles pointed out, that China already very much dominates Pakistan, and Pakistan is hugely indebted financially to China. And China seeks to probably impose the same kind of sphere of influence, hegemony, over Afghanistan as well. And in so doing, there's a limit to how much Sharia you can signal wanting to implement, because the Chinese will not, for instance, accept for the Taliban to start meddling with the Uyghur question or with internal Chinese affairs when it comes to Islam and Muslims.
What about the rest of the Muslim world? Okay, we'll go to that, because we focus on I do want to explore Sharia elsewhere. But David, please.
Yeah, with regard specifically to Afghanistan, I think that there are going to be strong tensions between the leadership of the Taliban and the rank and file. Basically, the leadership has made it clear that it's trying to project a new image. It's trying to the extent that it can, actually present itself as kind of a changed entity. I don't actually accept that, but I do think that there are actually visible tensions that you can see inside Afghanistan, and that may lead to actually sections of the Taliban even splitting off or being open to claims that the leadership has somehow or another betrayed them, not fully implemented Sharia. And here I'd like to note that there's a couple of places in Afghanistan, such as Mazar, which girls are being educated. And it's very clear that those are areas that are culturally more affinity towards like Uzbeks and so forth, that are looking towards other different cultural areas that are much more liberal in their interpretations and so forth. So I think that the Taliban, at least at this particular time, will demonstrate some level of flexibility with regard to the implementation of Sharia. And I would say, or I would sense that may very well lead or be an opening for, let's say, IS Khorasan to even peel off some groups that hitherto have been supportive of the Taliban, who might be disaffected by the reality. Because we're bound to see that in actuality, the Taliban regime is probably going to be very corrupt. It's probably going to have a lot of dealings with narcotics. And so there's going to be an opening right there for certain puritanical elements of it to even say, that the Taliban are not really Muslims, maybe the revolution is not complete and so forth. So, yeah, I think that the issue of Sharia is something that can always be used to, to put pressure and to manipulate elites who probably have tendencies, kind of like at this particular point, like Bernard said, more of an internationalist direction, but the locals might have, the local rank and file might have a completely different viewpoint.
Thank you. You mentioned ISK, I think they're referred to, Khorasan. And I'm jumping to my third topic, and it deals with the possible escalation in the conflict between the Taliban and other groupings, the conflict with the IS. We know what ISK did. They are responsible for the suicide bombing, a very, very powerful and meaningful act in the Kabul airport. Just recently, a week ago, a bombing of a Shiite mosque in northern Afghanistan. So maybe you can also tell our listeners, any of you, what is the basic difference and what are the points of contention between the two groupings? And isn't the IS now more emboldened to challenge the Taliban rule, with militants being far more radical than those of the Taliban? In other words, what's the future of the IS? And its impact, by the way, in other area of the region, like Iraq, Syria, and so forth. So,
well, I guess like they said in Egypt after the so-called Arab Spring, they talked about the fulul, or the remnants or the leftovers of the previous regime. To some extent, I believe we have some Daesh fulul now. Because the movement was significantly defeated. They were grounded in Sham, and with a significant to and fro movement into Europe, particularly in France, but also in Germany, Britain, and the like. And their model, which was a sort of network-based model, was finally destroyed both by the bombings, by cyber surveillance, and we now have in Paris a major trial, which is probably the biggest trial ever in the history of France since the Gauls, i.e. the trial of the 15th of November attacks of 2015, which led 130 people dead. And it is complicated for them to mobilize the masses. You know, we have this guy, the only suicide bomber who did not detonate his explosive belt, who's alive, who was arrested in Belgium, Salah Abdeslam, who every day makes a statement at the court saying that who killed more people? Is it you or us? And we just retaliated because you bombed Muslim babies and the like in Syria and Iraq, in Daeshistan at the time. But this is not raising much interest in the part of the so-called community. You know, it's much more important to show that the community is victimized, like Erdogan did last year, for instance, after the Charlie Hebdo people republished cartoons and it makes such a big fuss. Now they are not in a very good position, I believe. It's to me, their days are past, and therefore the Taliban is a significant alternative, even though ISIS may have people in Khorasan, as we saw, and to what extent is it still the ISIS that we knew in Sham and Iraq? I am not convinced that the ISIS still has has momentum. Now, what we see in Afghanistan is one thing. What we have in simultaneously in Europe is what I try to call atmospheric jihadism, i.e., people who are entrepreneurs of wrath, who single out targets on the web, like the French teacher Samuel Paty, who on this day 1 year ago was decapitated by a Chechen in front of his medium school in the outskirts of Paris because he was accused of having shown cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad to his pupils to discuss freedom or non-freedom of expression. And this, of course, has changed the situation, i.e. that we do not have organizations anymore. Like Al-Qaeda was a sort of pyramidal Leninist, if I may say so, system that sent people to be trained as pilots in the US and then send them to the Twin Towers, but they had no grassroots. Then we had, but ultimately the Al-Qaeda model was defeated in Iraq, among other things, by the Shias. Then we had Daesh or ISIS, which was much more of a reticular or a network-based model, more like the Gilles Deleuze rhizoma than the Leninist top-down model. It was more of a bottom-up thing. And they focused in both grassroots in Sham and in Western Europe, organizing circulation between the two. They organized the attacks through networks of friends, through the internet and the like. This model has also been defeated. And now we have a more sort of diverse jihadi landscape. On the one hand, those attempts to use the web to single out people, and then to through those entrepreneurs of wrath, as my colleague Bernard Rougier has called them, and then to entice some people who have been radicalized in mosques, on the web, through networks or whatever, to take the matter into their own hands. So I do not call them lone wolves myself. They they are not organized, but they have been ideologized, if I may say so, and they are ready to answer the stimulus that you have on the web. That's one thing. And on the other hand, you have the Taliban model. To what extent is the Taliban model going to be able to impact on those atmospheric jihadists in the rest of the world, or are they going to remain separate entities with a very little degree of cohesion? This, of course, is a question I believe that we can ask today. We have no evidence because the phenomenon is really new, but I believe this is part and parcel of the challenges that are in front of us.
Thank you. Anybody wants to add to that, or if I may?
Yeah, I'd like to comment just real briefly on IS Khorasan. I mean, basically, what you're looking at right there, vis-a-vis the Taliban, is the difference between a Deobandi and a Salafi organization, and that's, in my opinion.
Can you explain to the uninformed listeners?
I mean, Deobandis, just like Bernard said, are not necessarily hostile to Sufis, but Salafis are going to be extremely hostile towards Sufis and especially Shiites, and that's going to be reflected inside their tactics. And I mean, that's exactly what we see on the ground, is that ISIS Khorasan is willing to use suicide attacks in places that the Taliban really won't go, like maternity wards and so forth, we've seen, or in the course of mosques, etc. And that those sort of tactics, in my opinion, are not going to win them popular support. But as I said previously, it's possible that they could still peel off some level of military support from the Taliban, from disaffected military. I don't think that they have a chance of winning popular support within the context of Afghanistan, though.
I see. And upon this point, Iraq and Syria, do you, Bernard, think that, or do you see the possibility? And of course, we're dealing with the future, and I don't recall who was it who said that it's very difficult to make predictions, particularly with regard to the future. So we are dealing with the unknown and trying to make some observation. However, do you foresee an intensification that the model of success in Taliban may encourage?
Yeah, I mean,
radical groups in unstable, and I'm speaking about Iraq and Syria, particularly because these are two areas of political instability, and vacuums, as we know, do not remain vacant.
Yeah, I mean, look, there isn't really a vacuum in either country in the following sense. First of all, the Islamic State was defeated in both Iraq and in Syria. I mean, and defeated unequivocally and very clearly. Now, you have a tremendous number of Sunni Arabs in both countries who are disaffected, who are disenfranchised effectively in both countries, and who are very angry. And, the problem, though, for them is that, to wage a war, an organized campaign against either the Syrian state or the Iraqi state at this stage, you would need an external sponsor. You would need Turkey, you would need Saudi Arabia, you need somebody who will provide the money for the weapons, the territory in which you can fall back to and find refuge in. I don't think, certainly the Saudis are not interested in sponsoring jihadism or Sunni militantism of any kind. They've declared openly they're out of this business, largely because it generated a domestic Sunni fundamentalist and oppositional movement that wanted to destroy the Saudi state. So Sunni jihadism is an extremely combustible material, and even the Saudis don't want to touch it anymore. So I think that the Sunnis of Iraq and of Syria are really abandoned, orphaned communities, again, unless the Turks decide otherwise. And so I don't see a future for an effective jihadism emerging from there. What I see in Iraq and Syria, by contrast, is another kind of jihadism, a Shi'i jihadism that has the sponsorship of Iran. And that is a much more organized, much more effective, much better organized, and also ideologically coherent group of people. And they can be extremely destructive if they choose to turn on the West or turn on Israel or turn on Europe, and on the Sunnis, of course, as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you for mentioning the Shia here, because I was going to ask the members of the panel to say a word about this, about Sunni-Shia relations, and has the events in Afghanistan impacted it. And you just mentioned a scenario where Shiite radical response may shake the region, shake the world. David or Gilles, are you concerned by, is the Shia-Sunni relation stable? Has it been affected? Should we expect news?
It is not very stable. It has evolved recently in different ways. In this book that you kindly mentioned, which is not yet out in English, The Prophet and the Pandemic, I used the maps of my colleague Fabrice Balanche, and we sort of mapped the region between what we call the Brotherist Shia Alliance on the one hand and the Abraham Agreements on the other. What was very striking to me was that, like, for instance, when I was doing fieldwork in the Arab world during the so-called Arab revolutions, I remember interviewing Sheikh Qaradawi in Qatar those days. And he would not have words strong enough against the Shias, and particularly the attempted upheaval in Bahrain. He said that this had nothing to do with Arab revolution, that it was an Iranian plot against the Arabs, and it had nothing to do with whatever happened in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, in wherever. And now what we saw when there was the sort of blocus of Qatar by Saudi Arabia, by the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt, was that suddenly there was a rapprochement on behalf of political Islam, i.e., or the Muslim brother kind, essentially, between three countries, one Turkish-speaking, the other Arabic-speaking, Qatar, and the third Farsi-speaking, Persia or Iran, two Sunni, one Shia, that sort of tried to put aside the differences between Shiism and Sunnism, because in their backing of the Muslim brothers against Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the Emirates, who are very much anti-MB. And, for all we saw in Iraq, for instance, the very violent Shia Sunni antagonism, the massacres between the two, one has to remember that originally the Muslim brothers were not sectarian in terms of a Sunni movement against Shia movement. And the Iqtisaduna, our economy, was something that, was revered by Egyptian Sunni Muslim brothers, or even Sayyid Qutb, even though they were written by an Iraqi Shia, of course. And so even the Islamic revolution in Iran, was very much into reading Sayyid Qutb and Hassan al-Banna. And in 1984, the Iranians issued a postage stamp with the head of Sayyid Qutb behind bars as the supreme Shaheed. And Khamenei himself translated at least 2 books of Sayyid Qutb into Farsi. So there was some sort of a rapprochement between them, which of course Daesh was very much against, because remember also Al-Qaeda itself was not at all anti-Shia. And when there was this text by Zarqawi, who was intercepted by the Kurds and then published, which we published in our edited volume that you kindly mentioned, Al-Qaeda in its own words. Zarqawi said that, one bullet for the infidel American or Westerner was enough, but you should reserve 9 bullets for the Shias, because they had to be exterminated because they were living on the ground. But this is something that was not condoned at all by Zawahiri, who chastised Zarqawi on that matter. And even though people like Qaradawi may have used that on a very anti-Iranian stance during the Arab upheavals of 2011, it has undergone different stages of late. And one of the questions precisely, and this is still unclear, as I mentioned, is to what extent the Pasdaran have given some kind of hand to the Taliban in order to seize the country. Even whatever the differences between the two, because after all, as long as it harms Uncle Sam, it's not good for the Jews, but good for the Muslims, as they would say.
So 2 quick comments. First, you mentioned the rapprochement between Shia and Sunni, and there were many attempts along the years in the Palestinian context, which leads me to the Israeli-Palestinian scene in a minute. The PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, in its early stages, has made ideological attempts to show the consistency between the two schools, and even wanted to introduce Shia as a 5th school of thought. So this is one point, and I'll get to Israel in a minute. The other point that I want to make sure that we don't overlook is the rise of Qatar as a leading force. I don't want to say in the Islamic trend, but the name Qatar has been mentioned several times here, and definitely within the Palestinian context. So a quick reply from you before we move to Israel, because our time is almost gone. Do you see Qatar as the new kid on the block, and from an Islamic point of view? That what you, Bernard, said, that Saudi Arabia is now out of this business of trying to spread the world gospel. Would Qatar take its place?
So you're addressing it to me, the question?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so look, Qatar, let's just, a few facts. So Qatar is a country with about a native population of 200,000 people. Okay, so we're talking a neighborhood in Manhattan. It's unlikely to have the kind of role and weight to do anything comparable to the role that, let's say, Saudi Arabia played. That said, it's an extremely rich country. It has, I think, the 2nd largest gas reserves in the world, and it has adopted a policy for the last 25 years to promote the Muslim Brotherhood as a way of projecting its influence into the region and around the world. Because of its small size, it needed the network and the organizational capacities of the Brotherhood. Now that has backfired, largely because the Brotherhood is, has a bad name and a bad reputation in many places. In Europe, for instance, they often were a conveyor belt to much more radical forms of jihad. So the Qataris are having to now decide whether to continue with the sponsorship and patronage being offered to the Brotherhood or not. Now, in some cases, the Qataris, by the way, have played a very useful role by cultivating the Islamists. For instance, they were a key player in the negotiations between the Americans and the Taliban. That's where the Americans negotiated with the Taliban and continue to negotiate with the Taliban in Qatar. It's also a key player with Hamas, as you know, and a funder of Hamas. So the Qatari policy is one of being useful and helpful to other countries by having privileged access to these Islamists. Now, I suspect sooner or later this will backfire the way it backfired on the Saudis because of this combustible quality of Islamism and its capacity to end up becoming very jihadi and militant. So the Qataris are having at the moment to decide what kind of patronage they want to offer, how much they want to offer. The Turks, for instance, seem to be backing off. And so whether the Qataris will follow suit is a big question. I don't know. But Qatar can certainly play an influence because it has so much money that it can deploy to promote this ideology.
Okay, so one quick mention, Sheikh Qaradawi, if I'm not mistaken, is still in Qatar.
Yes.
And it's still his bastion.
Yes.
Well, follow up on what Bernard just said. I also have heard that, they are now trying to find their place in the new geopolitics of the region with the Abraham agreements and the like, and to what extent is support of the Muslim Brothers an asset or a liability for them? And this is being discussed precisely now. There are rumors which are spread by some serious sources saying that Al Jazeera Arabic is now being evaluated from that point of view in Qatar. And as Bernie just mentioned, the Turks are not as adamant as they were on their support of the Egyptian Muslim Brothers exiles. Many of them have been silenced. They have not been allowed to go public anymore because Erdogan needs some friends, in the good old days, Davutoglu used to say he had the zero enemy policy, and now Erdogan looks like he has more of a zero friends policy in the region. So he cannot antagonize everybody. And so this is something which needs to be followed definitely. In Tunisia, the Nahda party is in shambles, not only because of the antagonism with President Said after he seized most powers in his hands, but also because of internal disputes. And in Morocco, after the Abraham agreements that the local brothers, the Justice and Democracy Party, could really not swallow, they have lost significantly at the last elections. Whether or not these losses were genuine or were helped will be decided by the North African specialists. But the overall picture of the brothers is not that bright as of today.
So I have to cut you. Time is almost over, and we didn't get to the last point. But I will steal maybe a minute or two extra. Crystal, I see you on the screen. But I do need your reference to the last point, the Israeli context. And the question again that preoccupies public opinion in Israel and elsewhere is whether Hamas and the PIJ will be emboldened by the Taliban success. And, Hamas was the first to congratulate Taliban's leader on the demise of the US occupation. And, comparisons are being made. Just as Taliban managed to kick out the Americans after 20 years, we are now determined and we will succeed in putting an end to the Israeli occupation, and our Islamic path is the correct way. David, what's your take on this?
Honestly, I think that that's just bluster. I mean, I don't think that there's any translatable aspect of the Taliban victory to the Palestinian situation, to be blunt. It's just not, it's not at all similar. I mean, I grant that Hamas did make that congratulation, but there's nothing like the infrastructure, the popular support, the Palestinian government is just as corrupt as the Afghani government. There's no ability to mass armies or carry out attacks that could actually bring it to some sort of heel. I think it's just bluster.
Or not, you have an assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with David. I think it is bluster, and I think that Hamas. Look, in the Middle East, there are two visions basically right now. There's a vision of resistance to the West and applying the Sharia and all of that, which you see with the Taliban, you see with Hamas, you see with, and then you have another vision, which is a vision that you see the elements of in places like the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere, which, by the way, is an authoritarian, politically authoritarian and repressive vision, but it is one that is based on building human capital, diversifying the economy, in effect, imitating Israel's economic and cultural prowess. Okay, so that's the other vision, which is kind of an authoritarian, but very much science and technology and industry and education and so on. And those two visions are clashing with each other. I think that the resistance vision, which is the vision of Iran, which will bring nothing but destruction to the Middle East, as it has done in Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. And I would like the vision that I see out of the UAE and to some extent Qatar and Saudi and to succeed, because that's the path that will best serve stability, best serve the people of the region, and best serve the interests of the United States.
Well, I personally certainly support that. Gilles, very, very short last word about the Israeli-Palestinian scene, Hamas and PIJ.
The real tipping point is Qatar, precisely. Qatar has been funding Hamas thanks to Israeli mediation with the famous planes loaded with cash.
And Egyptian.
In Tel Aviv airport, and then giving the money to Hamas, which was a sort of strange policy in Israeli terms, which is now being looked into. And to what extent are they still going to fund Hamas to have leverage on the Israelis, or are they going to consider that it is in their interest to be part and parcel of the agreement that buys Israeli high tech in order to develop the energies of the future and to go to diversify their investments? I mean, this is to me a very interesting thing to look now to what extent Qatar is going to follow up backing Hamas and backing PIJ, or on the contrary, letting them down. And this, of course, will be a tremendous change if such things happen, but they have to get something in compensation, probably.
Thank you so much. We already are beyond our time, and I don't think that we'll have any time for Q&A. I do want to mention that there are two additional sessions, one in 2 weeks' time and one on the 4th. You see the slide here. We'll deal with the regional and international powers in the Middle East, and you see the name of the esteemed participants. And the third one on new regional configuration, including, of course, the Qatari element. So this is to come. We did touch upon this briefly, but again, our focus today was on the Islamic ramification, and I think that we covered more or less what I had hoped we'd do. All that remains for me is to, again, thank my co-organizer, Itai Senate, whom you see here, and he will be chairing the next session, and everybody who had been, and of course, the three speakers. You have been extremely successful in enlightening us regarding the events and also leaving us with some unanswered questions. So thank you very much, and hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.